The townsfolk of Copper Springs called it Devil's Tooth, a sheer mesa rising like a broken thong from the Arizona territory. When Emma Whitfield, their only doctor, became stranded atop its flat crown after a sudden rockslide, panic rippled through the settlement. "No man can reach that summit," declared Mayor Hollister, as lanterns flickered against the darkening sky. Behind the gathered crowd, Running Wolf stood silently, his eyes measuring the ancient routes only his people remembered. While others shouted useless suggestions, he quietly gathered his rope of braided yucca fiber, knowing what the white men didn't, that sometimes the impossible merely requires the wisdom his ancestors had carried for generations. Would the medicine woman trust an Apache to save her when all others had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Copper Springs hadn't always been much of a town. Just 5 years ago, it was little more than a watering hole with a saloon and a stable. The discovery of a modest copper vein in the nearby hills had changed all that. Not enough copper to bring in the big mining operations from back east, but just enough to support a growing settlement of about 300 souls. Emma Whitfield brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her face as she organized her medicine bag that morning. The leather satchel, worn smooth at the corners from years of use, had been a gift from her father when she'd completed her medical studies in Boston. It contained an unlikely mix of traditional physician's tools and small pouches of local herbs she'd come to rely on just as heavily. "You heading up to Devil's Tooth again, Doc?" The question came from Tom Hollister, the town's mayor and owner of the general store where Emma had stopped to purchase supplies. "Just for the afternoon, Tom," she replied, selecting a few hard candies from a jar on the counter. Little bribes for the children when they needed treatment. "The yarrow grows best on the mesa top, and I'm running low." The mayor shook his head. "I still don't like you making that climb alone. It's not proper, nor safe." Emma smiled patiently. She'd heard this concern countless times in the 3 years since she'd arrived in Copper Springs. At 32, widowed by the war, and with medical credentials that would impress physicians in any eastern city, she still faced the frontier notion that a woman needed constant protection. "The trail is perfectly sound, Tom. I've used it dozens of times." What she didn't mention was how she treasured those solitary hours on the mesa. Devil's Tooth rose 600 feet above the valley floor, its flat top covered with plants that thrived in the unique conditions. Up there, with the vast Arizona sky above and the town reduced to a cluster of toys below, Emma found a peace she never experienced elsewhere. As she paid for her supplies, she caught sight of a tall figure leading a horse to the blacksmith's shop across the street. Running Wolf. That's what the livery owner called him, though Emma suspected it wasn't his true Apache name. He worked with the horses at Sanders' Livery, known for a gentle hand that could calm even the most spirited mounts. Few in town spoke to him beyond giving orders or haggling prices. Emma had approached him once, nearly a year ago, inquiring about a plant the local women had mentioned for treating fevers. His response had been brief but precise, his English perfect despite the town gossip that claimed he barely spoke civilized. Since then, they'd exchanged nothing more than nods of acknowledgement. "That Apache still hanging around, I see," Hollister commented, following her gaze. "Sanders says he's reliable enough with the horses, but I can't say I sleep easier knowing he beds down so close to town." Emma gathered her purchases. "He's given no one any trouble that I've heard." "It's not about trouble given, it's about trouble coming. Where there's one Apache, there might be more. The Army's got most of them contained on the reservation, and that's where they belong." Emma made a non-committal sound. Arguments about the Indian problem were commonplace, but as the town's only doctor, she'd learned to keep certain opinions to herself. Her position was precarious enough as a woman in a man's profession. Outside, the April sun warmed her shoulders as she made her way past the new schoolhouse toward her small cabin at the edge of town. She'd perform her morning rounds, checking on Mrs. Patterson's newborn and old Mr. Dunning's rheumatism, before heading to the mesa. Her medical bag swung at her side, a constant companion that bridged her two worlds. Her formal training from the East and the practical frontier medicine she'd come to practice. just like Devil's Tooth bridged the earth and sky, standing as a silent sentinel over the growing settlement of Copper Springs. Emma glanced back once, catching sight of Running Wolf as he expertly guided a nervous mare into the livery stable. Their eyes met briefly across the dusty street. He inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement so subtle anyone else might have missed it. Emma returned the gesture before continuing on her way, unaware that by sundown their distant orbits would violently collide. Running Wolf led the nervous mare into the livery stable, his movements deliberate and calm. The animal sensed his quiet confidence, its skittish steps gradually steadying. He whispered words in his native tongue, promises of safety and understanding that no English phrase could properly convey. "Got away with them beasts, I'll give you that," Sanders called from where he shaped a horseshoe at his forge. "Wish you'd teach my boy your tricks." Running Wolf nodded but offered no response. Sanders didn't expect one. In the 8 months he'd worked at the livery, Running Wolf had perhaps spoken 50 words total. Not from any difficulty with English, he understood everything perfectly, but from the knowledge that his words held little value to these people. When the mare was settled, Running Wolf retrieved the stone knife from his belt to trim a length of leather for a broken bridle. The knife was one of his few possessions from before, its obsidian blade napped by his grandfather who had taught him the skill as a boy. Sharp enough to slice cleanly through the toughest materials, it was both tool and memory. He worked steadily through the morning, aware of the sidelong glances from townspeople passing the livery. Some were merely curious, others openly hostile. A few, like Doc Whitfield, acknowledged him directly. She was different from the others, her eyes held questions rather than assumptions. Running Wolf had first noticed her collecting plants along the base of Devil's Tooth shortly after he'd arrived in the area. While most white settlers moved through the land with noise and disruption, she had studied each plant with careful attention, her fingers gentle as she harvested only what she needed. When she'd approached him about fever remedies, he'd been surprised enough to answer. The knowledge she sought wasn't secret, merely overlooked by people who believed their ways superior. Since then, he'd observed her quiet competence and the respect she commanded despite being a woman alone. As midday approached, Running Wolf took his meal away from the livery, climbing to a small rise that overlooked both the town and Devil's Tooth. The massive formation had been a landmark to his people for generations. His grandfather called it Standing Eagle for its distinctive profile when viewed from the east. The white settlers saw only a tooth, always thinking of weapons or pain. From his vantage point, he could see a small figure beginning the ascent up the mesa's trail. The doctor, recognizable by her practical divided skirt and the medicine bag at her hip. He watched her steady progress with grudging admiration. Few women of any people would make such a journey alone. Running Wolf unwrapped a small bundle of dried meat and flat bread, eating methodically while his eyes scanned the landscape. This wasn't Apache territory by birthright. His mother's people came from mountains farther south, but he knew its contours intimately. After leaving the reservation 2 years ago, he'd traveled these lands extensively, learning each water source, game trail, and sheltered canyon. The stone knife rested beside him, catching the sunlight. His grandfather had carried it for 30 years before passing it to Running Wolf on his 16th birthday. "This blade remembers," the old man had said. "It remembers the hands that shaped it, the animals it has honored with a clean death, the plants it has harvested. A man must be like this knife, sharp, purposeful, carrying the memory of his ancestors in his actions." Running Wolf had lived by those words until the reservation, where purpose and memory seemed equally unwelcome to the Indian agents and soldiers. He had walked away one night, slipping past the guards with the silent skill that had earned him his name as a boy, not running from, but running toward something unnamed. He returned the knife to his belt and stood, scanning the clouds building over the western mountains. A spring storm was brewing, not unusual but potentially dangerous. He looked again toward Devil's Tooth, where Doc Whitfield would be collecting her plants, unaware of the changing weather. With a last glance at the distant mesa, Running Wolf returned to the livery. The storm might pass harmlessly, and the doctor's business was not his concern. Yet as he resumed his work, he found his eyes drawn repeatedly to the sky and the distant tooth of stone piercing the horizon. Emma made steady progress up the familiar trail that zigzagged across the eastern face of Devil's Tooth. The path was narrow but well-defined, worn by years of occasional use by prospectors and the curious. She paused halfway up to catch her breath, turning to admire the view. Copper Springs looked like a child's playset from this height, the buildings reduced to simple shapes arranged along dusty streets. The leather-bound journal in her satchel pressed against her hip, a comforting presence. The book contained 3 years of careful observations, drawings of plants with their medicinal properties noted, symptoms they treated, proper dosages. Knowledge combined from her formal training and what she'd learned from local women, both white and native. A true frontier pharmacopoeia that would have fascinated her colleagues back east. Emma continued upward, noting how the vegetation changed with the elevation. Near the top, she found what she sought. A patch of yarrow with the distinctive feathery leaves and tight clusters of tiny white flowers. She knelt, offering silent thanks before carefully harvesting only what she needed, leaving plenty to reseed. The summit of Devil's Tooth was surprisingly flat, roughly circular and perhaps 200 yards across. Sparse juniper and scrub oak dotted the stony surface, along with hardy desert plants that thrived in the harsh conditions. Emma moved methodically across the mesa top, filling her collection pouches with various herbs. She paused occasionally to make quick sketches in her journal, noting the robust growth after the winter rains. A distant rumble of thunder caused her to glance westward. Dark clouds had formed over the mountains, moving steadily eastward. Nothing unusual for April in the territory, but a signal that she shouldn't linger too long. Emma estimated she had at least 2 hours before the storm might reach Devil's Tooth. Plenty of time to finish her collecting and descend to safety. She moved toward the northwestern edge where sage grew in abundance, its silver-green leaves pungent in the warming air. As she knelt to cut several stems, a different sound reached her. Not thunder, but a deep grumbling from within the mesa itself. Emma froze, her knife suspended above the sage. The sound grew, a vibration she could feel through her knees against the ground. Pebbles began to dance beside her boots. "Dear God!" she whispered, scrambling to her feet. The western edge of the mesa shuddered as a section of rim suddenly gave way. The collapse wasn't large, perhaps 15 feet of edge falling away, but Emma knew instantly what it meant. The trail she had ascended curved around that exact section of rim. Heart pounding, she ran toward the eastern side, picking her way across the uneven surface as quickly as she dared. When she reached the trailhead, her worst fears were confirmed. The upper portion of the path had disappeared entirely, leaving a sheer drop of at least 30 feet before what remained of the trail continued below. Emma stepped back from the edge, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Panic wouldn't help. She systematically explored the perimeter of the mesa, searching for another way down. The southern face was a sheer cliff, impossible without proper climbing equipment. The western side, where the collapse had occurred, was equally impassable. The northern face offered more irregularities in the stone but nothing resembling a path. After a complete circuit, Emma faced the truth. She was trapped. The storm clouds loomed closer, the afternoon light already dimming beneath their shadow. She calculated her options. No one knew exactly where she was, though Tom Hollister would remember she'd mentioned Devil's Tooth. She had water in her canteen and a few food items in her satchel. If necessary, she could survive the night on the mesa, though the prospect of a storm was concerning. Emma opened her journal, making a careful note of her situation and the geological event she'd witnessed. If nothing else, she would document her experience methodically. Science had been her companion through the darkest days after losing William to the war. It would serve her now as well. The decision made, she gathered wood from the scrubby junipers to create a signal fire, placing it where it would be visible from town but sheltered from the strengthening wind. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Emma struck a match and set the kindling ablaze, sending a message to the world below. "I am here. I am alive. I need help." It was young Billy Sanders who spotted the smoke first, pointing toward Devil's Tooth as he ran into his father's livery. "Pa! Someone's up on the mesa. There's a fire." The blacksmith stepped outside, shading his eyes against the lowering sun. A thin plume of smoke rose from the flat top of the formation, barely visible against the darkening sky. "Damn fool prospector, most like," he muttered, but a sense of unease crept through him. "Billy, run fetch the mayor. Tell him there might be trouble up at Devil's Tooth." Word spread quickly through Copper Springs. Within half an hour, a crowd had gathered at the base of the mesa, peering upward at the signal fire that was now burning more brightly as darkness approached. Mayor Hollister pushed his way to the front, pulling out his silver pocket watch and checking the time with a worried frown. The timepiece had been a gift from the town council when he was elected, engraved with his name and position, a symbol of authority he took seriously. "Has anyone seen Doc Whitfield today?" he asked, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "She was headed up to Devil's Tooth this morning," offered Mrs. Patterson, cradling her infant. "Came by to check on little Thomas before she left. Said she'd be back by supper time to look in on him again." Hollister's frown deepened. "And she's not returned?" "Haven't seen her," confirmed Sheriff Davis, who had joined the gathering. "You think that's her up there, Tom?" The mayor nodded grimly. "She mentioned collecting yarrow from the mesa top. Must be her. Could she be hurt?" someone called out. "Or just stranded," said Garrett Williams, the mining engineer who'd recently arrived to assess the copper deposits. "That storm that blew through caused a rock slide on the western face. I saw it from the mine entrance. Could have taken out part of the trail." This announcement sent a ripple of concern through the crowd. Emma Whitfield was well respected in Copper Springs. As the only doctor for 30 miles, her safety was everyone's concern. "We need to organize a rescue," declared Hollister, slipping his watch back into his vest pocket. "Sheriff, gather some men with ropes and lanterns. Williams, you've got climbing experience. What do you think?" The engineer stepped forward, studying the mesa's dark silhouette. "The Eastern Trail is the only real access point, and if that's compromised..." He shook his head. "It's a 600-foot sheer cliff in most places. Without proper equipment and daylight, I wouldn't recommend an attempt." "So we just leave her up there all night?" demanded James Everett, Emma's brother-in-law and the town banker. "With a storm coming? Better than risking more lives in a foolhardy night climb," Williams replied firmly. "We could send a rider to Fort Bridger for help. The army might have proper climbing gear." "That's 2 days' hard ride," objected the sheriff. "And no guarantee they'd help for something like this." As arguments broke out among the men, Running Wolf stood at the edge of the gathering, listening. The Apache had followed the commotion from the livery, staying back from the crowd as was his habit. Now, hearing that the doctor was trapped, he studied the mesa with different eyes than the townspeople. Devil's Tooth wasn't just a dramatic landmark to him. He knew its contours intimately, had studied the ancient pictographs hidden in shallow caves around its base, drawings that told of his ancestors hunting on its summit centuries before the white settlers arrived. Most importantly, he knew of other routes, difficult paths only attempted by those with proper knowledge and skill. Mayor Hollister held up his hands for silence. "Here's what we'll do. We'll keep a vigil tonight. Maintain a bonfire down here so the doctor knows we're aware of her situation. At first light, Williams and anyone else with climbing experience can attempt to reach her or at least determine the condition of the trail." James Everett pushed forward. "That's not good enough, Tom. Emma is up there alone, possibly injured. We need to act now." "And do what exactly, James?" the mayor countered. "Scale a cliff in the dark?" Williams is right, we'd just be adding to the problem. As the debate continued, Running Wolf silently withdrew from the crowd, moving toward his modest camp behind the livery. He knew what needed to be done, but also understood that these men would not easily accept help from an Apache. Yet the doctor had shown him respect when few others did. He owed her the same consideration. Running Wolf worked methodically in the dim light of his small campfire. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he wove strands of yucca fiber into a rope. The plant's fibers, properly prepared and twisted, created cordage stronger than many would believe possible, strong enough to support a man's weight if crafted correctly. His people had been making such ropes for generations, the knowledge passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. Running Wolf had learned from both his grandfather and his mother, combining their slightly different techniques into his own method. A sound from the darkness made him look up. Mayor Hollister stood at the edge of the firelight, hat in hand, uncertainty written across his face. "Sanders said I'd find you here," the mayor began awkwardly. "I wanted to ask. That is, Williams mentioned you might know something about the mesa. About Devil's Tooth." Running Wolf continued working, his fingers never ceasing their rhythmic movements. After a moment, he nodded once. "Can it be climbed?" From another approach, Hollister pressed. "Yes." The single word hung between them. Hollister shifted his weight. Would you be willing to guide Williams and some of the men? Tomorrow at first light." Running Wolf set aside the section of rope he'd completed and looked directly at the mayor. "Tomorrow will be too late for the medicine woman." "You can't mean to try tonight," Hollister exclaimed. "Even Williams said it would be suicide in the dark." "For him, yes." Running Wolf stood, gathering the coiled rope. "Not for me." Hollister stared at the Apache, clearly torn between desperation and disbelief. "You're saying you can climb Devil's Tooth? Night, alone?" Running Wolf nodded again. That's impossible," Hollister stammered. "No man can reach that summit in these conditions." Running Wolf stepped past the mayor, moving toward the still visible crowd at the base of the mesa. "I will show you." Hollister hurried after him. "Wait now, let's discuss this reasonably." But Running Wolf continued walking, his path straight and purposeful. He reached the gathered townspeople, who fell silent as they noticed his approach. James Everett stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip. "What's he want?" Everett demanded of Hollister, who had caught up. "He says he can climb the mesa," the mayor explained, his tone conveying his own skepticism. "Tonight." A murmur ran through the crowd. Garrett Williams pushed forward, eyeing the Apache critically. "With what equipment?" the engineer asked. Running Wolf held up the yucca rope. Williams laughed incredulously. "That? You're going to scale a 600-foot cliff with a homemade string? That's madness." "It will hold," Running Wolf replied simply. "Even if it would, which I doubt, there's no way to climb that face," Williams insisted. "I've studied it. The Eastern Trail is the only viable route, and if that's gone, there are other ways." Running Wolf interrupted. "Known to my people." Everett stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. We're not entrusting my sister-in-law's life to some Apache fairy tale." "What's your interest in this, anyway?" Sheriff Davis asked, studying Running Wolf with narrowed eyes. Running Wolf met his gaze steadily. "The medicine woman showed respect. She helped a child from my camp last winter when others would not." This revelation caused another stir among the townsfolk. Few had known of Emma's occasional treatment of native patients. Garrett Williams cleared his throat. "Look, I admire your confidence, but this isn't something to be attempted lightly. The rock is unstable in places, the handholds few and far between. I know the stone," Running Wolf stated with quiet certainty. "I have climbed such places before." Mayor Hollister, sensing the crowd's growing interest, held up his hands. "Now let's think about this. If there's any chance—" "There's no chance," Everett exclaimed. "It's a ploy. For all we know, he's got friends waiting to ambush anyone who tries to help." Running Wolf's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. Without another word, he moved to the base of the mesa, studying the shadowed contours in the fading light. Williams followed, professional curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "You really think you can find a route up there?" Instead of answering, Running Wolf pointed to a barely visible line of discoloration on the rock face. A thin, diagonal seam running upward. "Ancient pathway," he explained briefly, "marked by those who came before." The engineer squinted at the indicated feature. That's not a trail." That's barely a crack. It is enough, Running Wolf replied, testing the weight of his coiled rope. I will bring her down. Running Wolf stood at the base of Devil's Tooth, feeling the cool night air against his skin. The townspeople had fallen silent, forming a half-circle behind him. Their lanterns cast long shadows across the rocky ground, creating pools of light and darkness. Above, the mesa loomed like a sleeping giant, its edges sharp against the star-filled sky. He removed his boots, knowing he would need the sensitivity of his feet to find purchase on the narrow ledges. The stone would be cold, but that discomfort was a small price for the increased security. He tied the boots to his belt, along with a small water skin and the coiled yucca rope. Before beginning, Running Wolf ran his hands over the rock face, feeling for the nearly invisible handholds that generations of his ancestors had used. His fingers found a small depression, then another, subtle markers that would be meaningless to untrained eyes. Beside one such handhold, barely visible in the lantern light, was a faded pictograph, 3 wavy lines above a simple stick figure. To the townspeople, it might appear to be nothing more than natural staining of the rock, but Running Wolf recognized it immediately. The sign marked the beginning of an ancient route, a message from his ancestors. Water Seeker, follow this path. He's found something, Williams murmured to the mayor. Look at how he's reading the rock. Running Wolf ignored the commentary, focusing entirely on the challenge before him. He secured his first handhold, tested his weight against it, then began to climb. The initial moves were the easiest, with relatively generous ledges and cracks. He moved deliberately, each placement of hand and foot considered and precise. 20 feet up, he paused at another pictograph, this one a spiral with a line cutting through it. Warning: difficult passage ahead. Running Wolf adjusted his route slightly, moving laterally before continuing upward. The rock here was different, a harder variety that eroded more slowly, creating fewer natural grips. From below, the townspeople watched with a mixture of skepticism and growing amazement. I'll be damned, Sheriff Davis whispered. He's actually doing it. Running Wolf was now 50 feet above the ground, his form dimly visible in the combined light of the stars and the lanterns below. The easy portion of the climb was behind him. Ahead lay a section of nearly vertical stone with minimal features. He studied it carefully, recalling his grandfather's teachings. The mountain speaks if you listen, the old man had told him. It tells you where to place your hands, where to avoid. The rock remembers the touch of those who came before. Running Wolf closed his eyes briefly, feeling the subtle textures beneath his fingertips. Then he moved upward into the more challenging section, his movements becoming even more precise and controlled. Each hold now supported his entire weight. A single mistake would mean a fatal fall. The wind began to pick up, swirling around the mesa and tugging at his clothing. Running Wolf pressed himself closer to the rock, becoming part of it rather than fighting against it. He found a narrow ledge just wide enough for his toes, allowing a momentary rest while he planned his next sequence of moves. Below, Mayor Hollister checked his pocket watch nervously. He's been climbing for 20 minutes. How much farther does he have to go? At least another 500 feet, Williams replied, his professional assessment tempered now with reluctant respect. If he maintains this pace, which seems unlikely given the difficulty, it would take hours to reach the top. Running Wolf continued steadily upward, finding another ancient marker, a handprint pressed into what had once been clay but was now permanent stone. He placed his own hand over it, feeling a connection across centuries. This was not just a climb. It was a retracing of steps taken by his people long before white settlers had named this place Devil's Tooth. He reached a small outcropping, barely large enough to sit upon, and paused to catch his breath. From this vantage point, approximately 100 feet up, he could see the town spread out below, the scattered lights of windows and lanterns like earthbound stars. The true stars above seemed closer somehow, their light clearer and more direct. Running Wolf untied his water skin and took a careful sip. The most challenging section lay ahead, a long traverse across a nearly blank face before he could continue upward. He studied the route, identifying the subtle signs that marked the ancient path. On the mesa's flat top, barely visible from his position, a small fire still burned, the doctor's signal. Running Wolf secured his water skin and resumed his climb, moving laterally now across the face of Devil's Tooth. His fingers found impossibly small edges, his toes balanced on features no wider than a coin. Yet he moved with certainty, following a path invisible to those who had not been taught to see it. Emma fed another handful of juniper branches into her signal fire, wincing as she shifted her weight. During her exploration of the mesa's edge, she had twisted her ankle on the uneven ground. Not a serious injury, but painful enough to make movement difficult. She had fashioned a crude compress from her handkerchief soaked in water from her canteen, but the swelling continued. The signal fire crackled and sparked, sending embers spiraling upward to join the stars. Emma had positioned it away from the scrubby vegetation to prevent any chance of a wildfire, building a ring of stones to contain the flames. The practical tasks had kept her mind occupied, preventing the panic that threatened at the edges of her thoughts. Now, as full darkness enveloped the mesa top, she allowed herself to assess her situation with clinical detachment. She had water for perhaps 2 days if carefully rationed. Food was more limited, just a few dried apple slices and a small piece of cheese she'd packed for her lunch. The spring night would be cold but not dangerously so. Her greatest concern was exposure if a storm developed. Emma pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. From her position, she could see lights in Copper Springs and what appeared to be a larger fire at the base of Devil's Tooth. The town was aware of her predicament then. The question was whether they could do anything about it before her supplies ran out. She thought of William, her husband, killed at Antietam 13 years earlier. They had been married barely a year when he enlisted. Emma had been completing her medical studies, unusual enough for a woman that she had faced constant skepticism and occasional hostility. William had supported her ambitions without reservation. "You've a healer's hands and a scholar's mind," he'd told her. "The world needs both." After his death, she had thrown herself into her work, eventually taking a position at a Boston hospital. But the crowded city had felt suffocating in her grief. When she heard about frontier settlements desperate for medical care, the decision to head west had seemed almost inevitable. The ring on her finger caught the firelight as Emma added more fuel to the flames. She rarely thought of it as a wedding band anymore. It was simply a part of her, like the small scar on her chin from a childhood fall or the strand of gray that had appeared in her hair the year she turned 30. Yet tonight, alone on the mesa with an uncertain future, she found herself twisting it absently, remembering. A sudden gust of wind sent sparks swirling, pulling Emma back to the present. The fire needed constant tending to remain visible from below. She had gathered as much wood as she could before darkness fell, creating a stack within easy reach. Now she carefully positioned several larger pieces to ensure the flames would continue for hours. As she worked, Emma became aware of movement in the periphery of her vision. She turned quickly, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. Emma limped to the eastern edge of the mesa, the direction from which she had ascended that morning. The lights of Copper Springs glimmered in the distance. The fire at the base of Devil's Tooth still burned, surrounded by the tiny figures of townspeople. They seemed to be watching something. She followed their collective gaze and gasped. A lone figure was climbing the sheer face of the mesa, barely visible in the combined light of stars and the distant lanterns below. The climber moved with slow deliberation, finding handholds where none seemed to exist. "My God," Emma whispered. "They've sent someone up." She watched, transfixed, as the figure continued to ascend. The climb appeared impossibly dangerous. One slip would mean certain death. Yet the mysterious rescuer moved with what appeared to be confidence, even grace. Emma returned to her fire, adding the largest branches to create a brighter blaze. If someone was attempting to reach her, she needed to ensure her position remained visible. She then took a stick and traced large letters in the dirt near the fire's edge. "Ankle injured but stable." As she finished, Emma paused, listening. The wind had died down momentarily, creating an uncanny silence across the mesa top. In that stillness, she heard it, the faint sound of movement against stone. Someone was definitely climbing Devil's Tooth. Emma moved back to the edge, squinting into the darkness. The climber had made significant progress, now perhaps halfway up the imposing cliff face. The figure was too distant to identify, but something about the methodical movements stirred a memory. Emma recalled the quiet Apache from the livery, the careful precision with which he handled the horses, his economy of motion. "Running Wolf?" she whispered to the night. It seemed impossible, yet who else in Copper Springs would attempt such a climb? Emma returned to her fire, determined to keep it burning brightly. If someone was risking their life to reach her, the least she could do was ensure they had a clear destination. She settled beside the flames, her injured ankle propped on her folded shawl, and prepared for a long night of waiting. 300 feet above the ground, Running Wolf reached a crucial decision point. The ancient path divided here, one route continuing directly upward along an increasingly blank face, the other traversing right toward a series of faint cracks. He pressed his forehead against the cool stone, feeling for the subtle vibrations that might guide his choice. His fingers touched the small medicine pouch that hung from a cord around his neck. Inside were objects of personal power: an eagle feather found on his 16th birthday, a smooth river stone from his homeland, a tiny carved wooden bear his mother had made. He never opened the pouch. Its power lay in the connection to those who had given him these items, not in the objects themselves. Running Wolf chose the rightward path, moving carefully across the exposed traverse. The handholds were minimal here, mere dimples in the rock face where his fingertips could gain just enough purchase to support his weight. His feet balanced on edges no wider than a knife blade. Halfway across the traverse, disaster nearly struck. A handhold that had appeared solid suddenly crumbled beneath his fingers. For one heart-stopping moment, Running Wolf hung by a single hand, his body swinging out from the cliff face. Below, he heard gasps from the watching townspeople. With practiced calm, he controlled the swing, bringing his body back toward the rock. His searching fingers found a new grip, a shallow depression barely deep enough for his first two fingers. It would have to be enough. Muscles straining, he pulled himself securely against the cliff once more. Running Wolf took a moment to steady his breathing. The small medicine pouch pressed against his chest, a reminder of all he carried with him. Not just physical objects, but the knowledge and spirit of his ancestors who had climbed this path before him. He thought of his first encounter with Emma Whitfield nearly a year ago. He had been exercising a nervous mare at the edge of town when a rattlesnake spooked the animal. As he calmed the horse, he noticed the doctor watching with interest. "You have a gift with them," she had said, approaching cautiously so as not to startle the mare again. Running Wolf had simply nodded, and used to direct conversation with the townspeople. "I'm looking for a plant," she had continued. "The women at the river crossing said it grows in this area. Good for bringing down fevers. Yellow flowers, serrated leaves." She had made a gesture with her hands to indicate the shape. "Golden seal," he had replied, surprising himself with his willingness to share the knowledge. "Grows in shade, near water. 2 miles west, in the oak grove." She had thanked him without the usual condescension he encountered from white settlers. Later that month, she had treated a young boy from his camp for a severe cough when the child's mother had hesitantly approached her. No payment had been requested. Now, hundreds of feet above the ground, Running Wolf pushed those memories aside and refocused on the task at hand. The traverse complete, he began climbing upward once more, finding slightly better handholds in the series of cracks. His progress slowed as fatigue began to set in. Each move required careful consideration, each placement of hands and feet precise. A mistake now would mean a fatal fall. Running Wolf settled into a rhythm. Move, test, rest, breathe, repeat. The repetition became a kind of meditation, his mind clearing of all concerns except the next handhold, the next step. Below, the townspeople continued their vigil. He could occasionally hear voices carried on the night air, though the words were indistinct. Running Wolf knew they were watching his progress with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant hope. Whether they wanted him to succeed for the doctor's sake or fail to confirm their beliefs about Apache limitations mattered little to him. He reached a small ledge, barely wide enough to sit upon, and paused to rest. The night had deepened, stars brilliant in the clear air. Running Wolf estimated he had completed more than half the climb, though the most technical section still lay ahead. He took a small sip of water, rationing it carefully. From this vantage point, he could see the fire on the mesa top more clearly. It burned steadily, indicating the doctor was still able to tend it. Positive sign. Running Wolf rolled his shoulders to release some of the building tension, then flexed his fingers to maintain circulation. The night was cool but not cold, favorable conditions for climbing. He thought of the stories his grandfather had told of hunters who had used these routes to track bighorn sheep, carrying full loads of meat down these same precarious paths. "The mountain is neither friend nor enemy," the old man had said. "It simply is. Your relationship with it depends on your understanding." Understanding was what Running Wolf sought now. Reading the rock's language with his fingertips, interpreting its messages through the soles of his feet. The mountain was speaking, and he was listening with his entire body. Emma stirred the fire with a branch, watching sparks rise into the night sky. Her ankle throbbed despite the compress, but she forced herself to move periodically to check on the progress of the climber. The mysterious figure continued to ascend the sheer face of Devil's Tooth with slow, deliberate movements. As she waited, Emma's thoughts drifted to the path that had brought her to this remote mesa top. The gold wedding band on her left hand caught the firelight, prompting memories she usually kept carefully contained. William Whitfield had been a professor's assistant at the medical college, brilliant, kind, and unusually progressive in his views on women in medicine. While other instructors had barely tolerated Emma's presence, William had engaged with her ideas, challenged her thinking, and eventually won her heart. "You'll be a finer physician than half the men with diplomas on their walls," he had told her after a particularly difficult examination where the professor had grilled her mercilessly. Their courtship had been brief but intense, filled with shared medical texts, late-night discussions of new treatments, and dreams of establishing a practice together. The wedding had been small, her parents still uncomfortable with their daughter's unconventional choices. 3 months later, William had announced his intention to enlist. The Civil War was tearing the nation apart, and he felt compelled to offer his medical skills to the Union Army. "It won't be long," he had promised. "The papers say it'll be over by Christmas." Emma twisted the ring on her finger, remembering their last night together before he departed for training. They had walked along the Charles River, making plans for after his return. A small house, perhaps children in a few years, a joint practice where they would treat all patients regardless of social standing. The telegram had come 4 months later. William, serving with a field hospital near Antietam Creek, had been killed when Confederate artillery overran their position. No body was recovered. Emma had completed her studies in a fog of grief, graduating with honors that felt meaningless without William to share in her achievement. She had worked at Massachusetts General for 2 years, treating soldiers returned from the front with missing limbs and shattered minds. The work was challenging but hollow, each patient a reminder of the husband she couldn't save. The opportunity to head west had come from an unexpected source, Dr. Henry Matthews, her former professor and one-time critic, who had connections with the territorial governor of Arizona. "They need qualified physicians desperately," he had told her. The posting would be difficult: primitive conditions, limited supplies, varied ailments from mining accidents to childbirths. "You'd be entirely on your own." It had sounded perfect. Emma's parents had been horrified at the idea of their daughter traveling alone to the frontier. "You'll be killed by Indians or outlaws," her mother had warned. Her father had been more practical. "How will you protect yourself? Who will build your surgery?" "It's not Boston, Emma." But she had been resolute. Boston held too many ghosts, too many memories. The frontier offered something she desperately needed: purpose and distance from her grief. The journey west had been arduous but liberating. Each mile of railroad track, each dusty stagecoach route had carried her further from the weight of memory. By the time she reached Copper Springs, Emma had felt something close to peace for the first time since receiving that telegram. The settlement had been smaller then, just a few dozen structures and perhaps 100 residents. They had greeted their new doctor with a mixture of relief and skepticism, particularly when they discovered Drive E. Whitfield was a woman. But a mining accident her second week had proven her skills, and a successful treatment of the mayor's wife for pneumonia had cemented her position. Emma had thrown herself into her practice, expanding her knowledge to include local remedies and native healing plants. She had built a life of quiet competence, if not happiness. The gold band remained on her finger, partly out of loyalty to William's memory, partly as protection against unwanted suitors in a town where women were scarce. A shower of sparks rose as a log collapsed in the fire, bringing Emma back to her present predicament. She checked the climber's progress again, noting with concern how the figure had paused for some time at what appeared to be a particularly difficult section. "Please be careful," she whispered, though the words were lost in the night air. Emma returned to the fire, adding the last of her gathered wood. The climbing figure, Running Wolf, she was increasingly certain, must be near exhaustion by now. What drove him to attempt such a dangerous rescue? They had exchanged perhaps 50 words in the 3 years she'd been in Copper Springs. Yet here he was, risking his life to reach her while the other townsmen stood watching from below. Emma found herself touching her wedding ring again, a habit she developed when confronted with unexpected emotions. William would have admired such courage, such skill. He had always judged people by their actions rather than their origins. Running Wolf faced the final 200 feet of Devil's Tooth with growing concern. The upper section of the mesa presented new challenges. The rock was more weathered here, less stable, with fewer reliable handholds. Each placement required testing before committing his weight. His muscles burned with fatigue, his fingertips raw from hours of contact with the abrasive stone. Yet he pushed forward, focusing on the rhythmic pattern of his breathing to manage the pain. The night had deepened around him, the stars overhead providing enough light to navigate by once his eyes had fully adjusted. Running Wolf paused, studying the patterns above. Stars had guided his people for generations, the 7 sisters, the Great Bear, the hunter with his bright belt. Tonight they seemed especially clear, as if offering their light specifically for his journey. He identified the stars his grandfather had taught him to use for direction, confirming his route up the rock face. The next section would require a leap of faith, literally. A gap of nearly 3 feet separated the ledge where he rested from the start of a promising crack system. Too far to reach even with his height. He would need to jump, catching the edge with his fingers, then secure his position before his momentum pulled him away from the cliff. Running Wolf studied the target carefully, memorizing the exact spot where he would need to land. He tested the yucca rope coiled at his waist, ensuring it was secure. Then he gathered himself, muscles tensing for the leap. Below, the townspeople must have sensed the danger of his position. A hush had fallen over the watchers, their lanterns held still. Running Wolf ignored them, concentrating solely on the task before him. He jumped. For a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne, suspended between earth and sky. Then his fingers connected with the rock, finding the narrow edge he had aimed for. The impact sent pain shooting through his already strained hands, but he held firm, feet scrabbling against the cliff face until they found purchase. Secure once more, Running Wolf allowed himself a moment to breathe. The jump had been successful, but the cost was high. His reserves of strength were diminishing rapidly. He would need to find an easier section to recover, or risk a fatal mistake from exhaustion. Fortunately, the crack system he had reached offered better holds than the previous section. He made steady progress upward, finding a rhythm that allowed brief moments of rest between moves. The mesa's summit was now clearly visible against the night sky, the doctor's fire a beacon drawing him upward. As he climbed, Running Wolf found himself thinking of his brief encounters with Emma Whitfield. He recalled her careful attention when he had described the location of medicinal plants, the respect in her eyes unlike anything he typically experienced from the settlers. Later, he had observed her treating patients, white, Mexican, and in one instance, a young Apache boy from a family camped near the river. She had an unusual directness, this medicine woman. She looked people in the eye regardless of their station or origin. Running Wolf had noticed her quiet competence, her lack of the nervous chatter that characterized many of the town's women when near him. A loosening stone brought his attention sharply back to the present. Running Wolf adjusted his position quickly, compensating for the lost handhold. The upper portion of the mesa was more treacherous than he had anticipated, weathered by centuries of wind, rain, and temperature extremes. He glanced upward, gauging the remaining distance. Perhaps 100 feet remained, challenging, but within reach if he maintained his concentration. The fire on the summit appeared brighter now, suggesting the doctor was still able to tend it. Running Wolf moved methodically upward, each placement of hands and feet a careful negotiation with the mountain. His people had a saying, "The cliff does not care if you live or die. Only you can decide which it will be." The choice was made through preparation, skill, and respect for the stone. Above, a subtle change in the rock formation caught his attention. The cliff face, nearly vertical for hundreds of feet, began to angle slightly inward near the top, an overhang that would present the final and perhaps most difficult challenge of the climb. Running Wolf paused beneath the overhang, studying possible routes. The direct approach seemed impossible. The rock bulged outward with few visible holds. But to the right, a thin crack system offered a potential passage, though it would require extreme finger strength. He chose the crack, inserting his fingers into the narrow opening and pulling upward. The strain was immediate and intense, his weight hanging primarily from the first two joints of his fingers. Running Wolf moved quickly through this section, knowing he couldn't maintain such a grip for long. As he neared the top of the overhang, a voice reached him, faint but distinct. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The doctor's voice, coming from directly above. Running Wolf looked up to see Emma Whitfield leaning carefully over the edge, her face illuminated by the firelight behind her. "I can see you," she called down. "You're almost there." The edge seemed solid here. Her unexpected presence gave Running Wolf a final surge of energy. With renewed determination, he navigated the last few moves of the overhang, fingers finding just enough purchase to maintain his grip. With a final surge of effort, Running Wolf pulled himself over the edge of Devil's Tooth, rolling onto the flat surface of the mesa top. For several moments, he simply lay there, eyes closed, lungs burning with exertion, fingertips throbbing from hours of contact with the unforgiving stone. "You made it," Emma said softly, kneeling beside him with amazement in her voice. "I can hardly believe it." Running Wolf opened his eyes to see the doctor leaning over him, her face illuminated by the nearby fire. Concern creased her brow as she studied him with a professional gaze. "Your hands," she said, reaching toward them but stopping short of touching. "May I?" Running Wolf nodded, sitting up slowly. Every muscle in his body protested the movement after the sustained climb. Emma gently took his hands in hers, turning them to examine the damage. His fingertips were raw and bleeding in places, palms abraded from the rough stone. "These need cleaning," she said, reaching for her medicine bag. "The risk of infection is significant." Running Wolf watched as she worked, her movements efficient and practiced. She extracted a small bottle of antiseptic, cotton pads, and a tin of salve. When she applied the antiseptic to his wounds, he didn't flinch despite the burning sensation. "Running Wolf," he said, breaking the silence between them. "That is what they call me in town." Emma looked up from her task, surprised by his initiative. "Yes, I know. I'm Emma Whitfield, though you probably already knew that as well." "The medicine woman," he acknowledged. A small smile touched her lips. "Dr. Medicine Woman? It depends who you ask." She resumed tending his injuries. "Why did you come? Why risk your life like this?" Running Wolf considered the question. The truth was layered, complex. "You helped Two Feathers' son last winter," he said finally, "when others would not." Emma's hands paused momentarily. "The boy with pneumonia? I didn't realize you knew them." "All Apache know each other," Running Wolf replied, a hint of irony in his voice. "At least, that is what the white men believe." This drew a genuine smile from Emma. "I stand corrected. She finished bandaging his hands with strips of clean cloth. But surely that's not reason enough to attempt an impossible climb. Running Wolf looked toward the fire. Not impossible, just forgotten. He flexed his fingers carefully within the bandages. My grandfather showed me these paths when I was a boy. His grandfather showed him. Emma followed his gaze to the fire. You knew another way up when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The mountain remembers those who respect it, he said simply. Their conversation paused as Emma shifted position, wincing visibly. You are injured, Running Wolf observed. My ankle, she confirmed. I twisted it trying to find another way down after the rockslide. It's not broken, just sprained. Running Wolf moved to examine her ankle. His touch surprisingly gentle despite his bandaged hands. Emma had fashioned a rudimentary compress, but swelling was evident even in the firelight. May I? He asked, gesturing to her medicine bag. Emma nodded, curious. Running Wolf searched through the various pouches until he found a small bundle of herbs she had collected earlier that day. He selected several leaves of yarrow and a sprig of sage, then crushed them between his fingers, releasing their aromatic oils. Cold water, he requested. Emma handed him her canteen. Running Wolf dampened the crushed herbs, then carefully removed Emma's makeshift compress and applied the herbal poultice to her ankle. Reduces swelling, he explained. Cools the injury. Emma watched with professional interest. I use yarrow for bleeding and fever, but not typically for sprains. Different preparation, Running Wolf replied. Different purpose. He secured the poultice with her handkerchief, tying it more firmly than she had managed on her own. The relief was almost immediate, a cooling sensation that seemed to penetrate deep into the inflamed tissues. That's remarkable, Emma said, genuinely impressed. You know healing as well. Running Wolf sat back. Different kinds of knowing. They fell into a comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Dawn was still hours away, but the eastern sky showed the first hints of lightning. Below, the townspeople maintained their vigil, their lanterns visible as pinpoints of light at the base of the mesa. They will expect us to come down, Emma observed. Running Wolf nodded. When there is more light. Not before. Is there a safer way down than the trail I used? She asked. No simple path, he admitted. But I have rope. He touched the coiled yucca cord at his waist. Strong enough to lower you. Emma looked at him skeptically. That doesn't look nearly long enough to reach the bottom. Not all at once, Running Wolf explained. In sections. There are ledges where I can secure it. Emma considered this, studying his face in the firelight. There was intelligence there and quiet confidence. Against all logic, she found herself trusting this man she barely knew. Thank you, she said finally, for coming when no one else would or could. Running Wolf acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod. Rest now, he suggested. The descent will require strength. Emma settled closer to the fire, arranging her shawl as a cushion against the hard ground. Running Wolf remained sitting, his gaze turned toward the vast landscape spreading beneath the mesa, now softly illuminated by the approaching dawn. The first pale light of dawn revealed the full extent of their precarious situation. Emma stood carefully at the edge of Devil's Tooth, leaning on Running Wolf's arm for support as they surveyed the daunting drop below. The mesa's edge had crumbled further overnight, leaving a sheer face that extended unbroken for hundreds of feet. You truly climbed that? Emma asked, still struggling to believe what she had witnessed. Running Wolf nodded. Different route than we will take down. He guided her away from the edge and back toward the remnants of the fire. There, he began uncoiling the yucca rope, checking each section for strength and durability. Despite its seemingly primitive construction, the rope was remarkably strong, with a smooth, almost silky texture where it had been carefully worked. I need to fashion a harness, Running Wolf explained, measuring a length of the rope against Emma's waist. Emma watched as his bandaged hands worked with practiced efficiency, weaving and knotting the fibers into an intricate pattern. Where did you learn to make rope like this? She asked. My mother taught me, he replied, focused on his task. She learned from her mother. The knowledge is very old. He completed a complex series of knots, creating a harness with loops for Emma's legs and a secure point at her back where the main rope would attach. The design was ingenious in its simplicity, distributing weight evenly while providing stability during the descent. "You'll need to try it," Running Wolf said, holding the harness open for her. Emma hesitated only briefly before stepping into the loops. Running Wolf adjusted the fit, his movements professional and respectful despite the necessary proximity. The harness hugged her body securely, the yucca fibers surprisingly comfortable against her clothing. "How will this work exactly?" Emma asked, testing her weight against the construction. Running Wolf explained the descent plan methodically. He would secure the rope to a large boulder near the edge, then lower Emma down to the first substantial ledge about 100 feet below. Once she was safely positioned, he would untie the rope and drop it down to her, then climb down unassisted. They would repeat this process for each section of the descent. "That means you'll be climbing without protection," Emma observed, concern evident in her voice. "It is the only way," Running Wolf replied simply. "The rope is not long enough for both." Emma studied his face, reading the determination there. "And if you fall?" "I won't." The quiet confidence in his voice should have seemed arrogant, but instead conveyed a simple statement of intent. This man had already accomplished what the entire town had deemed impossible. Who was she to question his ability to complete the journey? Still, the risk was enormous. Emma's medical mind cataloged the potential injuries: broken bones, internal bleeding, head trauma, all likely fatal given their remote location. And yet, remaining on the mesa offered its own dangers. Her supplies were limited, and no one else seemed capable of reaching them. "Why not wait?" she suggested. "The town could send for equipment, proper climbing gear." "Days away," Running Wolf countered. "Weather changing." He gestured toward the western horizon, where clouds were beginning to gather once more. "Rain coming by nightfall." Emma knew he was right. The spring weather in the territory was unpredictable, with sudden violent storms common. A drenching rain would make the rock treacherous, perhaps impossible to navigate safely. Running Wolf finished adjusting the harness, then met her eyes directly. "Your decision," he said quietly. "Trust or wait." In that moment, Emma realized the true nature of the choice before her. This wasn't simply about the safest method of descent. It was about placing her life in the hands of a man the town barely acknowledged as human. A man who had risked everything to reach her when others had declared it impossible. She thought of her medical training, the careful weighing of risks versus benefits that guided every treatment decision. The logical choice seemed clear: wait for proper equipment, for a team of rescuers, for optimal conditions. Yet something deeper pulled at her. An intuitive recognition of Running Wolf's extraordinary skill and unwavering determination. He had climbed Devil's Tooth in darkness, finding a path where none seemed to exist. If anyone could bring her down safely, it was this quiet man with ancient knowledge in his hands. Emma straightened, decision made. "I trust you," she said simply. Something shifted in Running Wolf's expression. A brief softening around the eyes, an acknowledgement of the significance of her words. He nodded once, then returned to making final adjustments to the harness. "We should go soon," he said, glancing at the brightening sky. "Better light now, but not too hot." Emma made a final check of her medicine bag, ensuring everything was securely packed. Her journal, medical supplies, and the remaining herbs she'd collected were all carefully stowed. As Running Wolf prepared the anchor point for the rope, Emma took a last look around the mesa top, the scene of her unexpected ordeal and what might prove to be a pivotal moment in her life. "Ready?" Running Wolf asked, the completed descent system now in place. Emma took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." The eastern face of Devil's Tooth glowed amber in the morning light as Running Wolf made final preparations for their descent. He had secured the yucca rope around a massive boulder near the edge, testing it repeatedly to ensure it would hold Emma's weight. The townspeople below had noticed the activity, forming a larger gathering at the base of the mesa. "They're watching," Emma observed, peering carefully over the edge. Probably been there all night. Running Wolf nodded without comment. The town's concern was for their doctor, not for him. He understood this reality without resentment. It was simply the way of things. Emma checked her medicine bag one last time, then reached into a small side pocket and withdrew a brass object. "Before we start, I want you to have this," she said, holding it out to Running Wolf. It was a compass, its brass case worn smooth from years of handling. The directional needle quivered slightly under the glass face, seeking north with unwavering certainty. "It was my father's," Emma explained. "He was a ship's navigator before settling in Boston. It's guided me all the way from Massachusetts to Arizona territory." Running Wolf took the compass carefully, studying the instrument with interest. He had seen such devices before but never owned one. "For luck," Emma added with a small smile. "And because I trust you to guide us down safely." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Running Wolf. This was no trivial trinket but a treasured possession with both practical value and personal meaning. He tucked the compass securely into his shirt. "We go now," he said, helping Emma to the edge where he had prepared their descent point. The first stage of their plan was the most straightforward but perhaps the most frightening for Emma. She would need to back over the edge, trusting the rope and harness entirely as Running Wolf lowered her to the first substantial ledge about 80 feet below. "Remember," he instructed as he helped position her at the edge, "keep your feet against the rock, walk down slowly. I control the rope from here." Emma nodded, her face pale but determined. She gripped the rope with both hands, positioning her back to the drop. "I'm ready," she said, voice steady despite her evident fear. Running Wolf began paying out the rope gradually, allowing Emma to lean back into the harness. The critical moment came as she transitioned from standing on solid ground to being suspended over the void. Her knuckles whitened on the rope, but she followed Running Wolf's instructions perfectly, keeping her feet against the cliff face. "Good," he encouraged as she began walking backward down the vertical surface. Small steps. Below, the townspeople had noticed the descent beginning. A collective murmur rose from the gathering, followed by shouts of encouragement that drifted up to Emma's ears. She couldn't make out individual words, but the supportive intent was clear. Running Wolf focused entirely on controlling the rope, feeling each subtle shift in tension as Emma navigated the rock face. His bandaged hands burned with the effort, but he ignored the pain, maintaining a steady, controlled descent. Emma moved with surprising confidence for someone attempting such a maneuver for the first time. Her practical nature served her well. Once she had committed to the plan, she executed it with methodical precision, following Running Wolf's occasional quiet instructions from above. About halfway to the first ledge, a section of rock crumbled beneath Emma's foot, sending small stones clattering down the cliff face. She gasped, momentarily losing her footing and swinging out from the wall. Running Wolf immediately locked the rope, preventing any further descent until she could stabilize herself. "Breathe," he called down to her. "Find new footing." Emma forced herself to remain calm, searching the rock face with her boots until she found secure placement. "I'm stable," she called up after regaining her position against the cliff. The descent continued without further incident until Emma reached the broad ledge that marked their first stopping point. She unclipped from the harness as Running Wolf had instructed, securing herself against the inner wall of the ledge. "I'm safe," she called up. "You can drop the rope." Running Wolf untied the rope from the boulder and carefully fed it down to Emma, making sure it didn't snag on any protruding rocks. With the rope delivered, he faced the most dangerous part of the plan, climbing down to her position without any protection. For Running Wolf, this was simply a continuation of what he had already accomplished during the night ascent. He studied the rock face briefly, identifying the most promising route, then began climbing down with the same careful precision he had demonstrated throughout their ordeal. Emma watched his descent with a mixture of awe and anxiety. His movements were fluid and confident, each placement of hands and feet deliberate and secure. Still, a single mistake would be catastrophic. The townspeople below had fallen silent, all eyes fixed on the solitary figure navigating the sheer cliff face without rope or equipment. Even those who had expressed the most skepticism about the Apache were now watching with undisguised amazement. Running Wolf reached the ledge where Emma waited, dropping the final few feet with practiced ease. He immediately began preparing the rope for the next stage of their descent, checking the harness and testing the edge of the ledge for suitable anchor points. "That was remarkable," Emma said quietly, handing him her canteen. "Are you all right?" Running Wolf took a small sip of water before returning the canteen. "Yes," he replied simply, though the strain of the continuous climbing was evident in the tight lines around his eyes. Next section easier. Better handholds. By mid-morning, Emma and Running Wolf had completed 2 more rope sections, bringing them roughly halfway down Devil's Tooth. The sun now beat directly against the eastern face, turning the cliff into a radiating surface of heat. Both were conserving water, taking only small sips when absolutely necessary. From their current position on a narrow ledge, the town appeared much closer, though still 300 feet below. The gathering of people had grown, with nearly half of Copper Springs now watching their descent. Someone had raised a red bandana on a long pole, waving it when they successfully reached each new ledge, a simple signal of encouragement visible from their height. "Your brother-in-law?" Running Wolf observed, nodding toward a figure pacing at the front of the crowd. "He worries." Emma glanced down, recognizing James Everett's distinctive posture even from this distance. "He feels responsible for me since William died," she explained. "Sometimes too responsible." Running Wolf said nothing, but his silence conveyed understanding. Every community had its protectors and controllers, those who believed they knew what was best for others. He secured the rope for their next descent, creating an ingenious anchor by wedging it into a narrow crack in the rock and bracing it with stones. The system distributed weight across multiple points, providing redundancy if any single element failed. "This section is steeper," he warned, helping Emma into the harness once more. "Less features on the rock. Keep your body away from the wall." Emma nodded, her confidence in the process growing with each successful stage. The initial terror of hanging suspended hundreds of feet above the ground had subsided into a focused concentration on the immediate task. Her ankle still throbbed, but the herbal poultice Running Wolf had applied was keeping the worst of the pain and swelling at bay. As Running Wolf began lowering her down the cliff face, Emma noticed a change in the texture of the rock, a smoother, more polished surface with fewer cracks and ledges. Her boots skidded slightly, finding less purchase than before. "Small movements," Running Wolf called down, sensing the change through the rope. "Like walking on ice." Emma adjusted her technique, pressing more gently against the rock and relying more heavily on the rope support. The descent continued steadily until they were about 30 feet from the next ledge. Without warning, a chunk of rock the size of a dinner plate broke free just above Emma's position. She heard it before she saw it. A sharp crack followed by the whistle of air as it plummeted past her, missing her shoulder by inches. The sudden movement caused Emma to swing outward, rotating away from the cliff face. For several terrifying seconds, she spun slowly in the open air, the rope twisting above her. From below, gasps and shouts rose from the watching townspeople. "Emma!" Running Wolf called, using her given name for the first time. "Find the wall." Fighting against the natural instinct to flail, Emma forced herself to make deliberate movements, extending one leg until her foot contacted the cliff face. With careful pressure, she stopped the spinning and gradually brought herself back against the rock. "I'm all right," she called up, her voice remarkably steady despite the close call. Running Wolf resumed the controlled descent, moving her more quickly now past the unstable section. When Emma finally reached the ledge, she unhooked from the harness with shaking hands, pressing herself against the relative safety of the inner wall. The red bandana below waved vigorously, acknowledging her safe arrival. Emma managed a small wave in return, though she doubted it was visible from that distance. Running Wolf's descent to join her was even more impressive than his previous climbs. The smooth rock offered minimal handholds, yet he navigated it with the same methodical precision, finding minute features that somehow supported his weight. When he finally reached the ledge, Emma noticed fresh blood seeping through the bandages on his hands. "You're bleeding again," she said, reaching for her medicine bag. Running Wolf shook his head. "Later. We continue while light is good." Emma reluctantly agreed, knowing he was right. They had made good progress, but still had a significant distance to cover before reaching safety. The weather to the west was deteriorating, clouds building into the towering formations that often preceded afternoon thunderstorms. As Running Wolf prepared the rope for their next descent, Emma checked her ankle. The swelling had increased despite the herbal treatment, and putting weight on it was becoming increasingly painful. She reapplied some of the crushed herbs from her collection, binding them tightly against the injury. "2 more sections," Running Wolf said, glancing at her ankle with concern. "Then easier ground." Emma nodded gratefully. "I can manage." From below, a new development caught their attention. Several men, led by Garrett Williams, had begun climbing up from the base using the remnants of the original trail. They had reached perhaps 100 feet up, carrying ropes and what appeared to be mining equipment that might aid in the rescue. "They're trying to meet us," Emma observed. Running Wolf studied their progress. "Good. Less distance for you." He didn't need to state the obvious, that any help from below would make the final stages of Emma's descent safer and less dependent on his increasingly exhausted body. Though he showed few outward signs of fatigue, Emma had noted the growing tension in his movements, the careful way he conserved energy between bursts of effort. She reached out impulsively, placing her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Whatever happens from here, you've already done the impossible." Running Wolf met her eyes briefly, a wealth of unspoken communication passing between them. Then he returned to the rope, preparing for the next stage of their journey down the face of Devil's Tooth. The final stages of the descent progressed more rapidly than either Emma or Running Wolf had anticipated. The party from below, led by Williams with his mining expertise, had managed to establish a secure position about 200 feet up the cliff face. From there, they extended ropes that significantly shortened the dangerous portion of Emma's journey. When she was finally lowered into the waiting arms of the rescue party, a cheer erupted from the crowd below. Strong hands guided her onto a more substantial ledge where Clive Peterson, the town's former veterinarian who now assisted with medical matters when Emma was unavailable, waited to examine her. "Let me see that ankle, Doc," Peterson said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Looks like you've had quite an adventure." Emma submitted to his examination, though her eyes remained fixed on the cliff above where Running Wolf was making his way down to their position without rope assistance. "The Apache did this?" Peterson asked, gesturing to the herbal poultice on her ankle as he carefully unwrapped it. "Interesting mixture. Yarrow and something else I don't recognize." "Sage and juniper," Emma explained. "It's been remarkably effective for the swelling." Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "I'll have to remember that. Swelling's still considerable, but no discoloration suggesting a break." He began rewrapping the ankle with fresh bandages from Emma's own medical bag. "We've rigged a chair of sorts to carry you down the rest of the way. No sense putting weight on this if you don't have to." Emma was about to protest when Running Wolf arrived at their ledge, dropping lightly from the final few feet of his climb. The rescue party regarded him with a mixture of awe and lingering suspicion, creating a subtle but noticeable space around him despite the crowded ledge. Williams was the first to approach him. "That was some climb," the engineer said, professional respect evident in his voice. "Never seen anything like it." Running Wolf acknowledged the comment with a slight nod, his attention focused on Emma. "You are safe now," he stated, the simple words carrying layers of meaning between them. "Thanks to you," Emma replied. She turned to the others. Running Wolf climbed Devil's Tooth in darkness when everyone said it was impossible. He fashioned a rope system that brought me down safely. Without him, I would still be stranded up there. The men shifted uncomfortably, several avoiding eye contact. It was one thing to witness the Apache's remarkable feat, another to acknowledge a debt to him. "Well," Williams said finally, "we should get moving before the weather turns." He gestured to the makeshift chair they had constructed from mining timbers and rope. "If you'll allow us, Doctor?" Emma reluctantly settled into the chair, which was designed to be carried down by 4 men taking turns in pairs. As they secured her, James Everett pushed his way onto the ledge, having climbed up despite his lack of experience. "Emma!" he exclaimed, kneeling beside the chair. "Thank God you're safe. I've been sick with worry." "I'm fine, James," she assured him. "Just a sprained ankle and some minor scrapes." Everett glanced at Running Wolf, his expression hardening. "What possessed you to trust your life to him? If anything had happened—" "Nothing happened," Emma interrupted firmly, "except that Running Wolf accomplished what no one else could or would attempt." She met her brother-in-law's gaze directly. "I owe him my life, James." Before Everett could respond, Williams called for attention. "We need to move out now. The path is narrow in places, single file where possible. Doc Whitfield's chair goes first, followed by Peterson to monitor her condition. The rest of you follow in order." As the party prepared to descend, Running Wolf remained slightly apart, watching the proceedings with impassive eyes. Emma noticed his isolation and called to him. "Running Wolf, will you walk beside me? I'd feel safer with you nearby." The request created a moment of awkward silence, broken by William's practical response. "Good idea. He knows this cliff better than any of us at this point." And so the descent continued, with Running Wolf walking alongside Emma's chair when the path allowed. The remaining distance passed without incident, each step bringing them closer to the growing crowd at the base of Devil's Tooth. When they finally reached level ground, the townspeople surged forward, eager to welcome their doctor back to safety. Emma was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, patients, and friends expressing relief at her rescue. Mayor Hollister pushed through the crowd, his face solemn with official concern. "Doc Whitfield, on behalf of the entire town, let me say how relieved we are to see you safely returned." He cleared his throat. "And I believe we owe a debt of gratitude to Running Wolf for his assistance in this matter." The acknowledgement, though stiffly delivered, represented a significant concession from the mayor. Several townspeople murmured agreement, though others remained silent, unwilling to credit an Apache with such an achievement. Peterson helped Emma from the carrying chair onto a proper stretcher for transport to her cabin. As they prepared to move her, she reached out to grasp Running Wolf's arm. "This isn't finished," she said quietly, for his ears alone. "I'll expect to see you tomorrow so I can properly tend those hands." Running Wolf's expression remained unchanged, but a subtle warmth entered his eyes. "The medicine woman gives orders now," he observed, the barest hint of humor in his voice. "The doctor," Emma corrected with a small smile, "prescribes rest and proper care for your injuries. Professional opinion, not an order." As the stretcher-bearers lifted her, Emma's gaze remained fixed on Running Wolf, standing solitary amidst the celebrating town. In the bright light of midday, covered in dust and dried blood from his extraordinary climb, he appeared simultaneously part of their world and separate from it. A boundary walker between cultures, just as she was in her own way. As the town celebrated Emma's safe return, attention gradually shifted to Running Wolf, still standing at the base of Devil's Tooth. Though Emma had been safely delivered to her cabin for rest and recovery, Running Wolf's remarkable achievement had left an uncomfortable awareness among the townspeople. Here was a man they had largely ignored or disdained, who had accomplished what they had deemed impossible. Mayor Hollister approached him awkwardly, hat in hand. That is, the town would like to offer you payment for your assistance with Doc Whitfield's rescue." Running Wolf regarded him silently for a moment. "No payment," he said finally. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Well, at least let us provide you with a meal and fresh bandages for those hands." Running Wolf glanced at his bloodied bandages, considering the offer. "The doctor will tend my hands tomorrow," he replied. "She has ordered it." This statement caused a ripple of surprise among those close enough to hear. The idea of Emma Whitfield, the town's respected physician, personally attending to an Apache was unexpected, though perhaps understandable given the circumstances. As the crowd began to disperse, many townspeople cast curious glances back at Running Wolf. Some nodded acknowledgement, a few muttered thanks, others simply stared. The boundaries that had so clearly separated him from the community had blurred, if not dissolved entirely. Garrett Williams lingered, his professional interest evident. "That climbing technique of yours, I've never seen anything like it. No tools, no spikes, just reading the rock somehow." "The mountain speaks," Running Wolf said simply. "You must listen." Williams shook his head in wonderment. "Well, whatever you call it, it was remarkable engineering. If you ever want work at the mine where climbing skills would be useful, come see me." The offer was unexpected, but Running Wolf merely nodded, neither accepting nor declining. As Williams departed, James Everett approached, his expression guarded. "My sister-in-law is safe, and for that I'm grateful," Everett began stiffly. "But I want to be clear, her invitation to tend your injuries doesn't mean. That is, Emma sometimes forgets her position in this community." Running Wolf met his gaze steadily. "The medicine woman knows her mind." Everett's jaw tightened. "She's a widow still grieving my brother, and the town's only doctor. Her reputation is important." "I understand white men's ways," Running Wolf replied, his tone neutral. "I will come for healing, nothing more." This seemed to partially satisfy Everett, who nodded curtly before following the others back toward town. Running Wolf remained at the base of Devil's Tooth, alone once more. His body ached from the sustained exertion of the climb and descent, his hands burning beneath the crude bandages Emma had applied on the mesa top. He studied the cliff face in the clear light of day, tracing the nearly invisible route he had followed in darkness. The ancient path, marked by subtle signs his ancestors had left, had served its purpose once again. Few among the white settlers would ever understand what he had accomplished. Not just a physical feat, but a connection to generations of Apache who had navigated these lands before them. The sun had passed its zenith, casting the eastern face of Devil's Tooth into deepening shadow. Running Wolf turned his attention to the western sky, where dark clouds were gathering more rapidly now. The storm he had predicted was approaching, vindication of his insistence on immediate action rather than waiting for help that might have come too late. As the first rumbles of thunder sounded in the distance, Running Wolf finally departed from the base of the mesa, moving with the same quiet purpose that characterized all his actions. His camp behind the livery offered little protection from the coming storm, but he had weathered worse. The town appeared different as he walked its single main street. Faces that had previously avoided his gaze now watched him with new awareness. Sanders, the livery owner, actually nodded as Running Wolf passed, a gesture previously unthinkable. The changes were subtle but undeniable. A space had opened, however temporarily, in the rigid separation between Running Wolf and the community of Copper Springs. What would fill that space remained to be seen. At his simple camp, Running Wolf carefully removed the compass Emma had given him, studying it in the fading afternoon light. The needle swung decisively toward north, unwavering in its purpose. He thought of Emma's words, that it had guided her from Boston to Arizona territory, across vast distances and changing landscapes. Perhaps it would guide them both now in this new territory they were entering, one not marked on any map where old boundaries were suddenly less certain. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as Running Wolf placed the compass carefully among his few possessions. He constructed a small shelter of canvas and branches, protection against the worst of the coming storm. As he worked, his mind returned to the moment atop Devil's Tooth when Emma had first placed her trust in him, accepting the harness he had created and literally putting her life in his hands. In that moment, something fundamental had changed between them, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the artificial divisions of their respective worlds. What would come of that recognition remained uncertain, but Running Wolf felt its significance as deeply as he had felt the ancient routes beneath his fingers during the night climb. The morning after the rescue dawned clear and bright, the previous day's storm having washed the world clean. Emma sat at her kitchen table, ankle properly bandaged and elevated on a stool, reviewing notes in her medical journal. The cabin door remained open despite the early hour, an invitation to the visitor she expected. Running Wolf appeared in the doorway just as the town church bell rang 8 times. He paused at the threshold, awaiting permission to enter. "Come in," Emma called, setting aside her journal. I've been expecting you. He stepped inside, removing his hat with a natural courtesy that belied the town's perception of him as uncivilized. Emma gestured to the chair opposite her, where she had laid out fresh bandages, antiseptic and healing salve. "Let me see those hands," she said as he seated himself. Running Wolf extended his hands, the makeshift bandages now stained with dirt and dried blood. Emma unwrapped them carefully, revealing raw fingertips and deep abrasions across his palms, the physical cost of their rescue. "These need thorough cleaning," she observed, examining the wounds with professional detachment. "You're fortunate there's no sign of infection yet." She worked methodically, cleaning each wound with antiseptic that must have stung terribly, though Running Wolf showed no reaction. As she applied salve and wrapped fresh bandages, Emma found herself studying his face, the strong lines of his cheekbones, the quiet dignity in his expression, the intelligence in his dark eyes. "The people speak of nothing else," she commented as she worked. "How the Apache climbed Devil's Tooth in darkness when all said it couldn't be done." Running Wolf's expression remained impassive. "They will forget." "I won't," Emma replied simply. When she finished with his hands, an unexpectedly comfortable silence fell between them. It was Running Wolf who finally broke it. "Your ankle heals well?" Emma nodded. "The swelling is much reduced. Your herbal treatment was quite effective." She hesitated, then added, "I'd be interested to learn more about those preparations, if you'd be willing to share the knowledge." Running Wolf studied her face, perhaps searching for any sign of mockery or condescension. Finding none, he nodded once. "The plants speak of their purpose if you listen." "I'd like to learn to listen," Emma said. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the open door. Mayor Hollister stood there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable at finding Running Wolf already present. "Doc Whitfield," he greeted her, nodding stiffly to Running Wolf. "I hope I'm not interrupting your medical treatment." "Not at all, Mayor," Emma replied pleasantly. "What can I do for you?" Hollister cleared his throat. "Well, I've come on official town business. The council met this morning, and we've decided to formally recognize the extraordinary service rendered to our community yesterday." He turned to Running Wolf. "Your actions in rescuing our doctor demonstrated remarkable courage and skill. The town of Copper Springs would like to express its gratitude." From his pocket, Hollister produced a folded document. "This grants you formal permission to reside and work within the town limits without additional scrutiny or fees. It's signed by myself and all council members." The document represented a significant concession, effectively acknowledging Running Wolf as a legitimate resident rather than a tolerated outsider. Emma watched his face carefully as he accepted the paper, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Thank you," Running Wolf said simply, folding the document carefully and tucking it inside his shirt. The mayor hesitated, clearly having expected either more effusive gratitude or outright rejection. "Yes, well, it's the least we could do," he finished awkwardly. "Doc Whitfield, we're all relieved to see you recovering well. Don't rush back to your duties. Peterson can handle things for a few days." After Hollister departed, Emma and Running Wolf sat in silence for several moments. Finally, Emma spoke. "What will you do now? Will you stay in Copper Springs?" Running Wolf considered the question. "For a time. The horses need tending." Emma smiled at his characteristically economical response. "And perhaps there are plants to gather and knowledge to share?" He met her gaze directly. "Perhaps." As Running Wolf prepared to leave, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something. An eagle feather, its shaft decorated with intricate beadwork. "For courage," he explained, placing it on the table between them. "And for crossing heights." Emma understood the significance immediately. Among many native peoples, eagle feathers were sacred objects, given only as marks of great honor or respect. "Thank you," she said, touching the feather gently. "I'll treasure it." At the doorway, Running Wolf paused. "Tomorrow, if your ankle allows, I will show you where golden seal grows best. Better than the oak grove." The offer represented more than a simple botanical expedition. It was an invitation to cross the boundary between their worlds, to begin sharing knowledge that transcended the arbitrary divisions of their societies. "I'd like that very much," Emma replied. As Running Wolf walked away, Emma remained in her doorway, watching his retreating figure. Devil's Tooth loomed in the distance, its imposing silhouette now holding new meaning for both of them. No longer an insurmountable barrier, but a bridge between different ways of knowing and being. The impossible summit had been reached, and in doing so had forever changed those who had dared to make the climb.